All right. Well, I'm here with some coffee and another article that I wanted to take a look at. Yeah, this one's from Art in America, and it's mostly focused on the sort of rise and decline of figurative painting. There's some sections here that have nudity, so I'm just gonna sort of freeze here for a little bit and try to not scroll towards any sort of nudity or anything like that. Not that there's a problem with that or anything, but just in case somebody has kids or something. But the title of the article is called The Boom and Bust of Figurative Painting, and it's written by Barry Schwabsky. Yeah, and I'll just sort of get started. I'll read the article a little bit and then sort of give my 2 cents on it as well. So we'll see. I have some coffee and we're ready to go. There's a plausible story about the last half century of art making that would go something like this. By around 1950, almost all serious art was abstract. Soon enough, pop art, nouveau realism, photorealism, and other tendencies might seem to have heralded a return of the image, but they did not. What they heralded was the return of the Duchampian ready-made, sometimes an image form, though this too is a form of abstraction, an art of meta-images, if you will. And then the story continues. Art began to grope its way back from this extremity, first with the new image painting of the 1970s and its pictographic signs in abstract fields, then with neo-expressionism, a painterly frenzy that scooped up the broken forms of the old pictorial modes, put them together haphazardly, then spewed them out again even more messily than it found them. After that, for better or for worse, probably for worse, it was anything goes. That kind of history offers the pleasure and utility of being utterly clear. The problem is that things were much messier. In 1952, when Jackson Pollock was painting Blue Poles, Edward Hopper was painting Morning Sun, and the following year Francis Bacon painted the first of his Screaming Popes. In 1966, Mel Bachner mounted his pioneering conceptual art exhibition and was also writing in praise of Alice Neil's portraits. I could go on, but you get the point. Anyone who thinks that figurative painting died and made a comeback should remember that great old song by Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks. How can I miss you when you won't go away? That was very cheesy. Figurative painting, of course, never went away, but sometimes it makes more noise, attracts more attention in the market, and sometimes in the world of critics and curators. It will be remembered that about 15 years ago, collectors and speculators were hot on the trail of young artists making elegantly distressed, quasi-minimalist paintings with a conceptual edge, as critic Walter Robinson admitted before, almost single-handedly demolishing their market by coining for them the irresistibly derisive label of zombie formalism. With the 2014 defenestration of the zombies, a vacuum was created, needed to fill it with a new cohort of hot young artists whose work could be bought cheaply and resold quickly at a premium. Well, you can always depend on the pendulum effect of if abstraction has suddenly started to look dodgy, what about figuration? Lo and behold, a year and a half after Robinson's takedown, the same publication, Art Space, featured a story by another writer headlined "The Figures Back Baby." At MoMA PS1's Greater New York, artists vanquish zombie formalism with people art, drawing attention to emerging painters such as Gina Beavers, Marriott Dancy, Jamian Julio Vianney, and Greg Parma Smith. That year's iteration of the quinquennial Greater New York exhibition featured, per the museum, a heterogeneous range of aesthetic strategies, often emphatically representing the city's inhabitants through forms of bold figuration. If a figurative wave began circa 2015, it's held sway by now for a lot longer than the brief hypothesis of zombie formalism, presumably at least in part because recognizable images hold more appeal for viewers who are new to art. And coming during a period of market boom, it created some auction stars whose work also shows real substance, but also others whose success belies a fairly ordinary level of achievement and did not last long. Yet another headline, this time from the August 2024 New York Times, spells it out. Young artists rode a $712 million boom, then came the bust. The headline didn't name what the illustrations make clear. All those whose auction prices shot up and then just as quickly plummeted were figurative painters. And what was striking to me when I read the article was that although my work as both an art critic and an editor, and this is language from the writer, at an art magazine keeps me well informed about new artists on the scene, I have never seen or even read about the work of any of the artists featured. These were artists whose paintings had sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars without benefit of anything like a critical profile or a museum show. Their work had provoked no discussion, no speculation. That fact shows something about the reception of figurative painting over the past decade, its indiscriminate nature. Collectors, dealers, and even curators who ought to know better seemed so eager to latch on to new figurative painters that they hardly seemed to notice whether the ones they chose were genuinely exploring what painting can be or just churning out B-student variations. B-student variations on figurative forebears such as Alice Neal or Kerry James Marshall. The figurative painting boom coincided with a market bubble, and not just for art. It was a period that finance commentator Mahir Desai described as when, quote, magical thinking pervaded the wider investor class, end quote, a time of, quote, declining and zero interest rates, end quote, when, quote, mistakes and mediocrities were obscured or forgiven, while speculative assets with low probabilities of far-off success inflated in value, end quote. Yes, we know the market success does not equal aesthetic quality, but still, when weekend derivative work gets capitulated in dizzying price points, how surprised can one be when the fall is just as swift? One can be sympathetic to an artist whose work goes from selling at $100,000 to just $10,000 while still thinking they're lucky to sell it at all. Now look again at that Times article on the collapse of the market for young artists. Just as the photographers, rather than the text spelled out, that its beneficiaries turned victims were figurative painters, the same images made it clear that 3 of the 4 artists featured were black. The boom in figurative painting coincided with a more general surge of interest in the work of black artists that took off in tandem with the Black Lives Matter movement. But the effects were different in other areas of artistic activity. Black conceptual artists and abstract painters also suddenly became more visible than they had been for a long time, but in those fields, a similar speculative market in untried talent never seem to have taken off. Instead, elder or mid-career artists with oeuvres of proven substance like Charles Gaines and Stanley Whitney drew long overdue attention. And of course, there was good reason for the success of some of these new figurative painters too. The painterly intelligence of Jennifer Packer, for instance, is undeniable and poignant. The earthy brazenness of Samaya Critchlow's nudes can be haunting, but they are exceptions. Many of the young painters who've been taken up by the market have opted for obviousness over nuance and meaning, and as critic, I don't know how to pronounce this name. The family name is Molloy. Recently pointed out, reviewing a survey of black figurative painters at Zeitz Mocha for this magazine, a widespread tendency to imitate Kerry James Marshall in exaggerated and denaturalizing black figures' skin color, quote, risks positioning the black body as a gimmick, end quote. And the market, of course, loves a gimmick. So many young artists seem indifferent to Marshall's declared goal, quote, to undermine that tendency to project a certain kind of image of who we are into the world, end quote. On the contrary, blackness feels commodified in much of their work. Where zombie formalism was derided as soulless, this new wave of figuration leaned sincere, propelled by earnest efforts to right historical exclusions. That means that not only paintings of black figures, but also other images reflecting marginalized identities have been given unprecedented market support. Queer artists, in particular, have come to the fore. Louis Fratino and Samantour, for instance, with work whose popular success is matched by artistic promise. But after the January 20th inauguration of the second Trump administration and the onslaught against DEI initiatives, and what the Federal Office of Management and Budget seriously called Marxist equity, transgenderism, and Green New Deal social engineering policies in government, academia, and businesses, what's been called, and not hyperbolically, quote, the Great Resegregation, end quote, one has to wonder what support the collector class, let alone publicly funded museums, will be able to muster for black and other marginalized artists. Collectors' desire to show their goodwill by displaying recognizable scenes of black life on their walls could become a thing of the past, even among those who might want to send their Teslas to the used car lot. So, while market trends are always transitory in any case, it seems likely that the end of the figurative painting boom will be for exogenous reasons to do with the unfavorable economic and political climate of the times. But where does that leave the artists? In art, unlike politics, the burning question, what is to be done, can sometimes entail ignoring the immediate context and forging ahead according to an inner directive rather than an executive one. I should probably add here that I dismiss out of hand Dean Kissick's view that art wokeism, not the term he uses, but clearly what he means, destroyed contemporary art. No artistic technique is in itself conservative or progressive. In art, the how always outweighs the what. Just as abstract and conceptual artists proceeded with their work, notwithstanding the market drive towards figuration, in the coming decade we can expect that as some other craze takes hold, figurative painters may well cultivate their work in the shadows. They might even find that there are better rewards than getting rich off their work. I hope it doesn't sound corny and sentimental, to say so. It, yeah, I mean, I understand what this person is saying, but at the same time, um, money and funding provides support for an artist to continue to work. And it provides some level of validation for the work that they're doing. So, when someone like Dean Kissick says, things about or writes things about art wokeism, as much as the writer wants to ignore that, I think that there is a there is a there is something to be said about that. And I think it's important to just acknowledge that social sentiment does, in some ways, add to or continue that sort of social support and financial support. Anyway, what Marcel Duchamp said so long ago could still be true, that the great artists of tomorrow could go underground. And an underground might be just what the coming years call for. As for me, this is the writer, not me, the reader. Um, I've seen more than a few emerging painters making exploratory work, using the figure and doing so with integrity. More than that, making a mark on my memory that doesn't seem to fade. Here, I can just point to a few examples. One is Yu Nam Hong, Korean born and based in Brooklyn, whose enigmatic autofictional canvases painted with incredible refinement seem to go against the tide of much recent figuration by highlighting the plausible artifice rather than the supposed authenticity of identity. I wanted to counterfeit an Asian American woman character, she said. Walter Price, by contrast, embeds his representational fragments in a context of lyrical abstract mark-making. What what the Georgia native now living in New York has in common with Hong, for all their stylistic differences, is a will to complicate things, to show seemingly self-evident stories as questionable, and to, quote, make people more comfortable with being uncomfortable, end quote, using visual contradictions to symbolize ideas for themselves, but also to allow viewers to have their own story with these objects. I could go on. Bridget Mullen's psychedelic grotesque, the eerie oil pastels of Michelle O'Cotter, with their impossible quantification of solitary time. Izzy Wood's medieval millennial realism, with its fragmented images like close-ups from an imaginary film noir. These five artists hardly constitute a trend. Their works don't look like each other's or anyone else's, and while they represent different ethnicities and gender expressions, their life experience informs their subject matter without coming off as packaged and sold. In the end, we may all be typical of our times, but some artists are typical in ways that no one else is. Those are the ones who stand a chance of being remembered. Yeah, so this is, this is the article from Art in America that's written by Barry Schwabsky. And the thing that kind of grabs my attention is maybe a bit more, I don't know, like a bit more detached. I think, this person is, the way that they start writing about figurative painting is from these patterns from the 1950s onward. And I wonder if there is some level of compartmentalizing that happens when I don't know, like when someone is not making art and they're looking at it and they're experiencing what they choose to experience, there is, at least to me, there seems to be this sort of segmenting and um, compartmentalizing of what what is important, and that becomes a real question for me: is what is important? Like what does matter? You know, what and what is art? For me, it's one of those things where I can't quite find a solid definition, and sometimes I can find congruencies, or I can read something that someone else wrote, and I can, you know, I don't know, find some kernels of ideas for what art might be. Um, and that for me is a key thing, is that it might be something, but it has the potential or the possibility to be something else as well. And so it's interesting to me, this specific article that's about figurative painting, and looking at it um, from multiple decades, and trying to think of it in terms of social climate, in terms of social thought, and how, you know, someone from the outside might perceive something that is so internal, and the manifestation of those internal thoughts and connections and experiences that lead to this sort of culminating object. To me, that's something that's fascinating and elusive, and I don't have an answer for it. But I think thinking about this article, there does tend to be this intellectual sort of like grouping of things in order to make a cognitive structure that, I don't know, that tries to make sense of what's happening, or tries to make sense of um, um, what is happening, both in terms of like the context of collectors and curators, but for artists as well. And I do agree that I think some of the best work is going to go underground. I think that, at least from what I have seen and experienced, um, for many years, I think it's something that is very likely to happen, at least for the next, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, maybe less. Um, but I suspect that there is going to be a lot of movement within the arts that's not necessarily going to be apparent to a larger social consciousness for a little while. Part of that could be market collapse and a changing of incentive structures for artists. And I think another part of it could also come from artists seeking something different. Um, because I think for many, not everyone, of course, there's no way of, I think, having a universal statement, but I do think that for what's the word I want to use? I do think that there are multiple motivations for artists to choose to make work, and some of those have nothing to do with funding. Although funding does provide support and validation and the comfort of, a social cushion or a financial cushion to keep going. Whether things, improve or decline for that person. All right, well, I am out of coffee. And that's kind of it for this particular article. I'm probably going to be thinking about this for a bit longer. Maybe I think this is the type of article I might think about for at least like a week or a couple weeks. So I'm going to add a link to this to the description. There's a lot of images on here that I enjoyed experiencing, at least on like as a JPEG, but it'll be there for personal reference, both for me and for anyone else who's listening. And yeah, if you're listening, thank you so much.